The sun was shining brightly on a warm summer afternoon as Marcus Wilson, a hard-working young man in his early 30s, leaned back in a lounge chair by the pristine pool of his new apartment complex. The tranquil sound of splashing water and the chatter of children playing nearby was a welcome break from his demanding week. Marcus had recently moved to this upscale neighborhood, excited to start a new chapter of his life. With a book in hand and a refreshing drink on the small table beside him, he felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was his space, his home, and today he was determined to enjoy every moment of it. But serenity often has a way of being fleeting. Not far from where Marcus was sitting, a woman in her late 40s, dressed in an impeccably ironed blouse and oversized sunglasses, walked into the pool area. Her presence was noticeable immediately, not just because of her loud demeanor, but the disapproving look etched onto her face. Her name was Linda, though she was widely known among the residents as Karen for her tendency to meddle in everyone's business. Karen had lived in the complex for years and carried herself as if she owned the entire place. To her, the pool area was her unofficial domain, and she had no qualms about enforcing rules she believed were being broken, even if they didn't exist. As Karen strolled in, her eyes locked onto Marcus. She hesitated for a moment, her eyebrows furrowing as if trying to place him. In her mind he didn't quite belong, his relaxed posture and confidence seemed out of place to her, though she couldn't articulate why. It wasn't long before she decided to approach him. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter of children nearby. Marcus, engrossed in his book, looked up, momentarily surprised to find a stranger looming over him. "Yes? Can I help you?" he asked politely, setting his book down. Karen crossed her arms, her expression a mix of suspicion and thinly veiled annoyance. "Are you a guest here?" she asked pointedly, her tone implying that she already knew the answer she wanted. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the question. "Actually, no," he replied with a calm smile. "I live here, just moved in a couple of weeks ago." But Karen didn't seem satisfied. "Oh, which apartment?" she pressed, tilting her head as if her inquiry was a natural follow-up. Marcus frowned slightly, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Apartment 302, he replied, his tone still cautious. "Is there a problem?" Karen's lips pursed into a tight line. "Well, it's just, I've been living here for years, and I've never seen you around. We have certain standards here, and we can't just have anyone coming in and using the facilities. Do you even have a key card for the pool area?" At this point, Marcus couldn't help but chuckle softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small key card, holding it up for her to see. "Is this good enough for you?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. Karen's cheeks flushed, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Well, anyone could have borrowed that," she snapped. "I'm just looking out for the safety of the residents here. I think it's best if you leave until we can verify your story." Marcus stared at her, dumbfounded. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Mom," he said firmly, sitting up straighter, "I didn't have to prove anything to you. I pay rent here, just like everyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my afternoon." Karen's face twisted with indignation. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she exclaimed, her voice rising. Several heads turned in their direction as curious onlookers began to take notice of the commotion. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of the stairs around him, but he refused to let Karen's unwarranted accusations ruin his day. He leaned back in his chair, determined to ignore her. But Karen wasn't done. "I'm calling security," she declared, pulling out her phone with dramatic flair. "Let's see what they have to say about this." And just like that, the peaceful afternoon was shattered. Marcus sat there, a mix of disbelief and frustration washing over him. What should have been a simple day by the pool was quickly spiraling into an unnecessary confrontation. As Karen spoke into her phone, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how things had escalated so quickly. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. What happened next would leave everyone, including Karen, utterly speechless. The murmurs around the pool area grew louder as Karen paced back and forth, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried across the space, every word laced with the same self-righteous indignation. "Yes, there's someone here who doesn't belong," she said sharply, pausing as she listened to the person on the other end. "I'm telling you, he's being uncooperative and refusing to leave. You need to come handle this immediately." Marcus took a deep breath, doing his best to keep calm. This wasn't the first time he had encountered someone like Karen, but it was the first time it had happened so openly and in a place he called home. He glanced around the pool area, noting the mixed expressions of the other residents. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed curious, and a few appeared hesitant, as though they wanted to intervene but weren't sure how. For Marcus, the moment felt surreal. He had worked hard to get where he was, long hours, careful savings, and more sacrifices than he cared to count. Moving into this apartment complex had been a milestone for him, a symbol of all that effort paying off. But now, here he was, being publicly challenged over something as basic as his right to sit by the pool. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to relish the attention. She put her phone away, her posture stiff as she stood by the edge of the pool, arms crossed. "Security will be here any minute," she announced to no one in particular, as if the entire pool area needed to be informed. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Marcus couldn't help but shake his head. He could feel his frustration bubbling up, but he knew better than to let it show. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about holding on to his dignity. He decided to stay put, his calm demeanor a silent resistance to her baseless accusations. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted to his childhood. Growing up in a small town, he had always been taught to carry himself with pride, no matter what others might say or think. His parents, both educators, had instilled in him the importance of staying true to himself and never letting prejudice dictate his actions. It was a lesson he carried with him into adulthood, and it was one he leaned on heavily in moments like this. Still, the sting of Karen's assumptions wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just her words that hurt. It was the way she looked at him, as though he didn't belong, as though his presence was somehow a threat. Marcus had seen that look before, in countless small ways that most people wouldn't notice. It was the way someone might clutch their purse a little tighter as he walked by, or the nervous glance he sometimes got when stepping into an elevator. It was subtle, but it was there, a constant reminder that, to some people, he would always be an outsider. But Marcus wasn't about to let Karen's actions define his day. He adjusted his sunglasses and leaned back in his chair, determined to ignore her. If security came, so be it. He had nothing to hide. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew more tense. A few residents began to gather in small groups, whispering amongst themselves. Marcus caught snippets of their conversations. Some seemed sympathetic, while others appeared unsure of what to make of the situation. "Do you think he really lives here?" a woman muttered to her friend. "I don't know," the friend replied hesitantly. "But Karen's always been intense." Nearby, a man in his 40s shook his head, clearly unimpressed with Karen's behavior. "This is ridiculous," he said under his breath. "She's always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." Despite the undercurrent of support, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being on display. Every glance, every hush word felt like another weight added to the invisible burden he carried. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the security guard arrived. He was a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, dressed in the standard uniform of the complex. His name tag read Carl. As he approached, Karen immediately rushed to meet him, her voice rising with excitement. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, gesturing dramatically toward Marcus. "I've been trying to handle this situation, but he's being completely unreasonable. He claims he lives here, but I don't believe it for a second. You need to ask him to leave." Carl held up a hand, signaling her to slow down. "Ma'am, let me handle this," he said firmly before turning his attention to Marcus. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some ID and your pool key card, just to confirm you're a resident." Marcus sighed, reaching into his pocket. He had no problem complying with the request. It was a standard protocol after all. Handing over his ID and key card, he said, "Here you go. I'm Marcus Wilson from apartment 302. I moved in 2 weeks ago." Carl took the items, examining them carefully. As he checked the key card, he glanced at Marcus's ID, then at the address listed on it. After a moment, he nodded. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone professional but friendly. "Mr. Wilson is indeed a resident here." Karen's face fell, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to stunned disbelief. That can't be right," she stammered. "Are you sure? He doesn't look like he belongs here." Carl's eyes narrowed slightly, and his tone became more serious. "Ma'am, I've verified his information. He has every right to be here, just like you or anyone else. Now, unless there's an actual issue, I suggest we all move on and enjoy the day." But Karen wasn't ready to back down. "I'm just trying to protect the community," she protested, her voice shrill. "You can't blame me for being cautious. We can't let just anyone waltz in here and—" "That's enough," Carl interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "There's no issue here. If you continue to harass Mr. Wilson, I'll have to report this incident to management." For a moment, Karen stood frozen, as though the weight of Carl's words had finally sunk in. Her cheeks flushed, and she muttered something under her breath before storming off, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement. The pool area fell silent. All eyes were on Marcus, who sat there quietly, his expression unreadable. Carl handed back his ID and key card, offering a small nod of apology. "Sorry about that," he said. "If you have any further trouble, don't hesitate to let us know." "Thanks," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate it." As Carl walked away, Marcus let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. The incident was over, but the feeling it left behind lingered like an unwelcome shadow. He glanced around the pool area, noting the looks of discomfort and guilt on some of the other residents' faces. No one spoke, but their silence said enough. Marcus leaned back in his chair, determined to reclaim the peace he had come here for. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, why had it taken so much to prove something so simple? And why did people like Karen feel entitled to question him in the first place? Little did he know, this confrontation was just the tip of the iceberg. The events that would follow would change not only his life, but the dynamics of the entire community in ways no one could have predicted. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus stayed by the pool, determined not to let Karen's actions dictate his day. But the peace he fought to reclaim felt fragile. The air around him was heavy with unspoken words, the kind of tension that lingers long after the storm has passed. Every now and then he caught a few people glancing his way before quickly looking elsewhere. It was clear that the incident had left a mark on more than just him. Back in his apartment later that evening, Marcus couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. He tried to focus on unpacking the last few boxes in his living room, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Karen's accusations. It wasn't the confrontation itself that bothered him most. It was the principle of it. How could someone feel so comfortable questioning his presence, his rights, and, ultimately, his humanity without a second thought? He knew this wasn't just about a pool pass. It never was. As Marcus sorted through his belongings, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, he walked over and opened it cautiously. Standing there was a man in his mid-40s, casually dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. Marcus recognized him from the pool earlier, the one who had muttered about Karen sticking her nose where it didn't belong. "Hey," the man said, offering a small, sheepish smile. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Tom. I live in apartment 207. I wanted to check in after what happened earlier. That was uncomfortable to watch, to say the least." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his curiosity piqued. "Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it was definitely something," he replied, his tone guarded but polite. "What's up?" Tom scratched the back of his head, looking slightly awkward. "Look, I just wanted to say that not everyone here is like Karen. A lot of us were embarrassed by how she acted. Some of us even talked about bringing it up with the building manager. She's been causing trouble for a while, but today she really crossed the line. Marcus appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't sure how to respond. I get it, he said after a moment, and I appreciate you reaching out. But honestly, this isn't just about her. It's about something bigger. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. I figured as much. Anyway, if you need anything or if she gives you more trouble, don't hesitate to let me know. A few of us are trying to organize a residents' meeting next week. Maybe you could join us. Marcus considered the offer. He wasn't sure he wanted to dive headfirst into the drama of the building, but he also knew that staying silent wouldn't change anything. I'll think about it, he said. Thanks again for stopping by. After Tom left, Marcus sat on his couch, staring at the partially unpacked boxes around him. The weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders. He had moved here for a fresh start, but it felt like the challenges he thought he left behind had followed him. Still, he wasn't one to back down. If anything, the day's events only strengthened his resolve to claim his space unapologetically. Meanwhile, Karen was in her own apartment, fuming. She had spent the rest of the afternoon replaying the encounter, trying to convince herself she had been in the right. But deep down, Karen felt the sting of humiliation. Carl's calm but firm response had unsettled her, and the murmurs of disapproval from other residents hadn't gone unnoticed. For someone who prided herself on being in control, the day's events had thrown her off balance. Determined to regain her footing, Karen decided to write an email to the building manager. She framed her concerns as being about community safety and insisted that stricter rules were needed to ensure only verified residents use the pool. Though she didn't name Marcus directly, her wording made it clear who she was referring to. It wasn't enough to admit she was wrong. Karen needed to feel justified, and she would stop at nothing to make that happen. By the next morning, word of the poolside incident had spread throughout the building. The complex wasn't large, and gossip travelled fast. Residents who had missed the spectacle were soon filled in by those who hadn't, and opinions were as varied as the people who lived there. Some sided with Karen, agreeing that safety was a priority, though their support often seemed half-hearted, more about avoiding conflict than genuine belief. Others, however, were firmly on Marcus's side, outraged by the blatant unfairness of the situation. One of those residents was Jasmine, a single mother of two who had lived in the complex for 3 years. She had been sitting a few chairs away during the confrontation and had watched the whole thing unfold with growing disbelief. Jasmine had always kept to herself, but something about the way Karen had treated Marcus struck a nerve. She thought about her own children and the lessons she wanted to teach them about standing up for what was right. Inspired, she decided to speak out. Jasmine reached out to a few other residents who had witnessed the incident, including Tom. Together, they started drafting a letter to the building manager, detailing what had happened and urging the management team to address Karen's behavior. Jasmine also suggested that the complex host a community event to foster better understanding and connection among residents. If people actually know each other, maybe this kind of thing won't happen again, she said during one of their discussions. As the days passed, tensions in the building continued to simmer. Karen, sensing the shift in the community's mood, became increasingly defensive. She avoided the pool area altogether, retreating into her apartment and venting her frustrations to anyone who would listen. But even some of her usual allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with her actions. Marcus, meanwhile, tried to focus on his work and settle into his new home, but the incident refused to fade into the background. Everywhere he went in the building, whether it was the mailroom, the gym, or the parking lot, he could feel the lingering effects of that afternoon. Strangers stopped in to apologize, to offer support, or to share their own frustrations about Karen. It was overwhelming, but it also gave Marcus a sense of solidarity he hadn't expected. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt crushing. Late one evening, Marcus found himself staring out his window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He thought about how much easier it would be to ignore the situation, to keep his head down and let it blow over. But then he remembered his parents' words, the lessons they had taught him about courage and resilience. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community, about the kind of place he wanted to live in, and about challenging the biases that people like Karen carried so casually. Marcus didn't know what the next steps would be, but he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. And that, at least, was a start. The days following the incident seemed to stretch endlessly. Marcus continued his daily routine, but the undercurrent of tension in the building was impossible to ignore. Every time he stepped into the hallway or the elevator, he could feel the weight of people's eyes on him. Some offered kind smiles or quick nods, silently acknowledging their support. Others avoided his gaze entirely, as if pretending nothing had happened would make the situation disappear. Meanwhile, Karen's actions had set off a ripple effect she hadn't anticipated. The letter Jasmine and Tom had spearheaded was gaining traction. By the end of the week, over 20 residents had signed it, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of those demanding accountability. The building manager, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, finally scheduled a meeting to address the concerns. It was an unusual move. Residents' meetings were rare in the complex. But the situation had become impossible to ignore. Word of the meeting spread quickly, and it became the talk of the building. People speculated about what would happen, who would show up, and whether Karen would even dare to attend. Marcus was hesitant about going at first. He wasn't sure he wanted to relive the confrontation in front of a crowd. But after speaking with Jasmine and Tom, he realized how important his presence would be. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about standing up for something larger. On the day of the meeting, the community lounge was packed. Rows of chairs had been set up, and every seat was filled, with several residents standing along the walls. The room buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease. Marcus sat near the back, keeping a low profile, while Jasmine and Tom took seats closer to the front. Karen was notably absent, but no one seemed surprised. Sauron began the meeting with a calm but firm tone, outlining the purpose of the gathering and emphasizing the importance of mutual respect within the community. "We're here to discuss an incident that has sparked a lot of conversation," she said. "It's clear that this has touched a nerve for many of you, and we need to address it constructively." As Sarah spoke, Marcus could feel a tension in the room thickening. Several residents glanced in his direction, their expressions unreadable. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He hadn't planned on speaking, but something inside him told him he might need to. Jasmine was the first to stand up. Her voice was steady but passionate as she recounted what had happened by the pool. "It wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It was a deliberate attempt to make someone feel unwelcome in their own home. That's not okay, and it's not the kind of community I want to raise my kids in." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, and a few people even clapped softly. Tom spoke next, echoing Jasmine's sentiments and adding his own observations about Karen's history of confrontational behavior. "This isn't the first time she's overstepped," he said. "But this time, it went too far. We need to set a standard for how we treat each other." As more residents shared their thoughts, Marcus listened quietly, his emotions swirling. The support was heartening, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he now carried. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Finally, Sarah opened the floor to anyone else who wanted to speak. Marcus hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he considered staying silent, letting others fight the battle for him. But then he thought about his parents, about all the times they had told him to stand tall in the face of adversity. Slowly, he stood up, and the room fell silent. "First, I want to thank everyone who's spoken up," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "It means a lot to know that so many of you see what happened for what it was. But I also want to say this. It's not just about me. It's about how we see each other, how quick we are to judge, and how slow we are to listen." He paused, scanning the room. "When I moved here, I was excited. I thought this was a place where I could feel at home, where I wouldn't have to prove my worth to anyone. But that day at the pool, I was reminded that for some people, the color of my skin will always speak louder than anything else. That's not something I can change, but it's something we can all think about." The room was so quiet that Marcus could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause. Marcus sat back down, his chest tight, with a mix of relief and emotion. Just as the applause died down, the door to the lounge opened. All heads turned as Karen walked in, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. She had clearly been listening from outside. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as though considering turning around and leaving. But then she squared her shoulders and made her way to an empty chair near the front. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The tension that had begun to dissipate came rushing back, sharper than before. Sarah addressed her directly. "Karen, we've been discussing the incident by the pool. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Karen sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around the room, her gaze landing briefly on Marcus before darting away. "I was just trying to look out for the community," she said, her voice defensive. "I didn't mean for things to get so blown out of proportion." There were murmurs of disbelief from the crowd, but no one interrupted. Karen fidgeted with her hands, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe I was a little too quick to judge," she admitted reluctantly. "But I only had good intentions." The silence that followed was deafening. It was clear that her words hadn't landed the way she'd hoped. The tension in the room was at its peak, the unresolved conflict hanging heavy in the air. All eyes were on Marcus, Karen and Sarah, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The room remained charged with tension, Karen's words hanging in the air like a fragile thread about to snap. Marcus shifted in his seat, unsure of whether to respond or let the moment pass. Before he could decide, a voice from the back of the room cut through the silence. "Good intentions don't excuse bad behavior," an older man said, his tone firm. Heads turned to see Mr. Leonard, a long-time resident who rarely attended community events. He leaned heavily on his cane as he stood, his sharp eyes fixed on Karen. "You say you were looking out for the community, but from where I was sitting that day, it looked more like you were tearing it apart." Karen's face flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Mr. Leonard wasn't finished. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "People acting like gatekeepers, deciding who belongs and who doesn't. It doesn't end well, and it's not who we should be as neighbors." A ripple of agreement spread through the room, murmurs rising as others voiced their support. Karen sank deeper into her chair, her confident demeanor slipping away. For the first time, Marcus saw something that looked almost like regret flash across her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Just when it seemed the conversation was reaching its boiling point, Atara raised her hand, calling for calm. "Thank you, Mr. Leonard," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "This is an important conversation, but we need to keep it constructive. Karen, is there anything else you'd like to add?" Karen hesitated, glancing around the room. Her eyes briefly met Marcus's, and for a moment it looked like she might apologize. But instead, she shook her head. "I've said what I needed to say." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. "Very well. If there are no further comments, I'd like to propose some steps forward to address the concerns raised today." She began outlining a plan for community events, conflict resolution workshops, and clearer guidelines for shared spaces like the pool. The room gradually settled, the tension easing as the focus shifted to solutions. Just when it seemed the meeting was winding down, a soft chime echoed through the lounge. It came from Karen's phone, which she quickly silenced, looking flustered. But another chime followed, and then another, this time from someone else's phone. Confused, several residents checked their devices, their expressions changing from curiosity to shock. "What's this?" A woman near the front said, holding up her phone. "Who posted this?" Marcus's own phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a notification for a video titled, *Karen Exposed. What really happened at the pool? His stomach tightened as he clicked the link. The screen lit up with a shaky video of the confrontation at the pool, recorded from a distance. It was clear enough to capture Karen's accusatory tone, her insistence that Marcus didn't belong, and Carl's calm but cutting response. The room was filled with a cacophony of notifications as more people realized what was happening. Someone had leaked the video online, and it was spreading fast. Karen's face turned ashen as she snatched up her phone, scrolling frantically. "Who recorded this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Who posted it?" No one answered, but the murmurs around the room grew louder. Some residents exchanged knowing looks, while others openly whispered about the footage. Marcus felt a mix of emotions, shock, anger, and a strange sense of vindication. The video wasn't his doing, but its existence added a layer of complexity to an already tense situation. Karen turned to Sarah, her voice rising in panic. "This is slander. Someone's trying to ruin my reputation." Sarah held up her hands, trying to calm the room. "Everyone, please. Let's not jump to conclusions. Karen, I understand you're upset, but this meeting isn't about the video. It's about addressing the issues raised by the community." Karen wasn't listening. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Marcus. "Was this you?" she accused, her voice shaking with anger. "Did you film this?" Marcus stood, his posture calm but his voice firm. "No, I didn't," he said. "But does it matter? The video shows what happened, Karen. You can't deny it." Her expression hardened, and for a moment Marcus thought she might lash out again. But instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the lounge, her footsteps echoing the suddenly quiet room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of a phone vibrating on a nearby table. Finally, Sarah spoke, her tone measured. "I think it's clear that we still have work to do as a community. This meeting's adjourned, but I encourage all of you to reflect on what's been discussed today. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this." As people began to file out, the buzz of conversation grew louder. Marcus stayed seated, his mind racing. The video had escalated the situation in a way he hadn't expected. While it brought the truth to light, it also risked turning the conflict into something bigger, something beyond the walls of their building. Jasmine and Tom approached him as the room emptied out. "Are you okay?" Jasmine asked, her concern evident. "I'm fine," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "I just didn't see this coming." "None of us did," Tom admitted, "but maybe it's not such a bad thing. People need to see the truth." Marcus nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. The stakes had been raised, and he knew the story wasn't over yet. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the video was only the beginning of what was to come. The following days were a whirlwind. The video had gone viral far beyond the building. News outlets picked it up, labeling it as yet another case of racial profiling. Comment sections exploded with heated debates, while social media users shared it with hashtags demanding accountability. Marcus, despite being at the center of it all, felt like a bystander watching his life unfold in a way he could barely comprehend. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from strangers and friends alike, but it was overwhelming. He had never wanted this kind of attention. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to vanish. No one saw her in the hallways, at the pool, or even outside her apartment. Rumors swirled. Some said she had taken time off work, while others whispered she might be planning to move. For Marcus, her absence was both a relief and a source of unease. It felt like the calm before a storm. One afternoon, while Marcus was returning from a walk, he found a letter slipped under his door. The envelope was plain, with no name or address, but the handwriting was neat. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. Asterisk, meet me at the pool tonight. 9 p.m. We need to talk. Asterisk, there was no signature, but he didn't need one to guess who it was from. He debated whether to go. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to avoid reopening wounds that were just starting to heal. But another part, the part that sought closure, knew he had to face her. At precisely 9 p.m., Marcus walked out to the pool. The area was quiet, lit by the soft glow of the overhead lights reflecting on the still water. Karen was already there, sitting on one of the lounge chairs, her posture tense. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. Marcus stood a few feet away, arms crossed. "What do you want, Karen?" She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. "I messed up," she said finally. "I know I did. And I know I owe you an apology." Marcus didn't respond immediately, waiting for her to continue. "I don't know what I was thinking that day," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Maybe I was scared, maybe I was just ignorant, but when I saw you at the pool, I made assumptions that I had no right to make, and I hurt you. I hurt this whole community." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Marcus considered what to say. He could feel her remorse, but the damage she had caused wasn't something an apology could simply undo. "You didn't just hurt me," he said, his tone measured. "You made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. That's not something I'll forget easily." Karen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she said, "and I didn't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm sorry." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotions. Marcus sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I appreciate the apology," he said, "but it's going to take more than words to fix what's broken." Karen nodded again, wiping her eyes. "I understand. That's why I've decided to step away. I'm moving out of the building. I think it's for the best." Her announcement caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't expected her to leave, and a part of him wasn't sure how to feel about it. But before he could respond, Karen reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to him, her hand trembling slightly. "What's this?" Marcus asked, eyeing it warily. "It's a donation," she said, "to the community fund Jasmine mentioned. I know it won't erase what I did, but it's a start. Use it to bring people together, to heal." Marcus opened the envelope and saw a check inside, the amount more than he'd expected. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, tucking it into his pocket. As Karen stood to leave, she hesitated, looking back at him. "I hope someday you can see me as more than the person I was that day," she said. "But even if you can't, I'll keep trying to be better." With that, she walked away, leaving Marcus alone by the pool. He stared at the water, the ripples from a faint breeze breaking the stillness. Her departure felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, unfinished. The next morning, Marcus woke to another buzz of notifications. A new video had surfaced, this time showing Karen at her most vulnerable, leaving the pool the night before, apologizing to someone off camera. The caption read, * redemption or performance. Karen speaks out. * Marcus's stomach sank as he realized someone must have recorded their conversation. The video had already sparked a new wave of debate online. Some viewers praised Karen for taking accountability, while others questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking sympathy to repair her image. Marcus felt a surge of frustration. He hadn't asked for any of this, and now his private moment of closure had become public fodder. He called Jasmine, needing someone to talk to. "This is getting out of hand," he said, pacing his living room. "I saw the video," she admitted. "I don't know who posted it, but I think you need to focus on what matters. This isn't about Karen anymore. It's about you and what you want to do with all of this." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. Jasmine was right. The situation had spiraled far beyond their building, but he still had the power to shake the narrative. He decided to make his own statement, posting a video of his own. In it, he spoke candidly about the experience, emphasizing the importance of community, understanding, and accountability. He didn't name Karen, choosing instead to focus on the lessons everyone could learn. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with messages pouring in from people inspired by his resilience. The community fund grew rapidly, and plans for new events and initiatives began taking shape. Marcus found solace in the connections he was building, turning a painful experience into something meaningful. As for Karen, she moved out quietly, leaving behind a complex legacy. Some residents missed her, while others were relieved by her departure. But for Marcus, her apology and departure marked the end of a painful chapter and the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild, not just for himself, but for everyone. Yet, as he sat by the pool one evening, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the person who had walked away, and whether their paths might cross again in a way no one could predict.